Welcome to the Truth and Dialogue podcast, episode 3, and we're not going to cover the impeachment process quite yet, as that has proven to be a lengthy process to really dive into and understand properly, which you can understand. If you saw my preview or my quick update on YouTube, I'm really trying to dive into that and understand, especially now with it all over, or at least over for now. I'm trying to understand all the points brought up by both sides, and that's not a simple process. And especially with the mission of the podcast, the Truth and Dialogue, trying to determine if there is any truth to be discovered in that process, or was it simply a political theater played out by what we've seen to be true, at least for the most part, in the past 3 or 4 years, which is two very divisive parties hell-bent on winning the war, at all costs, winning the war of ideology and politics and power in government. And, are those the only motivators, or did the president do something absolutely factually wrong? I don't know. I want to dive into that to make my own determination, which I strongly suggest we all do. No, for this episode, I thought we'd get into something different. Belief in God, right? So that should be a lot simpler than the impeachment process. Ha, ha, ha. So just a second here. It's not going to be a lengthy one, because I don't imagine that I can do that kind of subject, any kind of justice, simply talking about my own journey or my own thoughts on the subject. It's most likely going to be a multi-part episode where I do want to finally bring in guests. I'd like to bring in folks that can say they truly believe in God and, have strong reasons why. And I'd like to have folks that say they don't believe in God and listen to their reasons why. Because I have a fundamental question that I'd like to discuss with a lot of people. And it's only in the past few months, excuse me, has it really been able to kind of play out in my own thought process. And to give you a little background on my kind of upbringing and my experiences with religion and church and that sort of thing, it's probably a lot like most people, where young growing up, we didn't go to church to start out with, and then at some point we did join a church that I always thought was a Pentecostal church. And at least the way I remember it, compared to what I found out to be currently, or at least is traditionally a Pentecostal church, is a little different. I think what you traditionally find is, women with long dresses and long hair and a very sort of conservative sort of environment. And what I was brought up in, the church I was but the church we went to when I was a kid was one of those churches where they sang a lot of songs. There was a lot of a lot of singing, a lot of um, very emotional sort of praise, hands in the air, people that would do that would faint. The pastor would go around and, touch the foreheads of individuals, pray for them. They would faint. There was speaking in tongues. So I don't know if that was truly a Pentecostal church or if I had the religion wrong or the practice wrong. But we stopped going there. I think I was around 13, 14, maybe 15. And I haven't really been back to a church since where I've been a member or, a normal attendee of the church. And I can tell you a little bit about myself that helps explain where I'm going with most of this, in that, growing up, I was into sports a lot, and I liked to draw. I was into art. So you might say that I had sort of a creative side. I always thought of myself as a creative person, and didn't really come to know more about myself or what that even meant and or why that was important at all until kind of my early 20s, I'd say, when I really started to get involved with computers and get to work with computers a little more. Growing up, we didn't have any computers. It wasn't a thing in our house until I think maybe my senior year of high school. And so I didn't just really discover the analytical side of myself until I was able to work with computers, because I discovered that I have a knack for absorbing software quickly. I can learn a new software just by really using it. I don't really need a lot of instruction. Anything that I can't figure it out, I know how to, kind of look up help guides and read and understand what those talk about. So, and when I first started to hear other people describe me as very logical, very analytical, and, kind of a numbers sort of person versus a creative sort of person, because not to put anybody in, a definite one side or the other, but, you could, there are some stereotypes that are generally true, right? People who are good with numbers, who are accountants or bookkeepers, that sort of person, you typically see they are a little more introverted, quiet, a little less creative. And it's because, that side of their brain is more, I guess you would say, prominent than the other side. And folks who are interested in art and who are creative and more kind of free thinking, and they are outgoing and more social, I kind of said that while I was saying it, but they are more interested in art and building things, creating things from scratch, that sort of career focus or interest. And so I guess you would say I kind of fought back at the notion that I was an analytical person, or I was somebody that was only, very logical. and not that creative side, because I had grown up, like I said, with interest in sports and interest in art, and I would draw a lot. And I actually originally went to college thinking I could major in drawing, which to me now sounds as silly as it may sound to some of you. But, of course, obviously now with animation the way it is now, that there are very lucrative careers in drawing or creation or animation, that sort of thing. So not to knock any of those professions. But then I started thinking back to my SAT scores. And I remember being surprised by my SAT score because, number one, it was kind of high, probably higher than I expected. But number two, it was, if you recall, at least the old SAT scores were kind of that split, between one side of the brain or the other. It was math, science versus, English and communication, I think. That's not the exact terms, I know, but I think everybody mostly gets the idea. But you could say that if you scored one higher on one side or the other, that could be a predictor of your personality. And then if you, somebody met you and had previously predicted what type of person you are based on your SAT score, they would likely be correct most of the time. They would, if you scored higher in English and sort of that creative, sort of outgoing communication side of things, then you would be more extroverted and more social and more creative, that sort of thing. So my SAT scores were split evenly right down the middle. So I scored exactly the same on both sides of the test. And for those of you who may have had similar experiences with that, maybe that helped you start to think about yourself in a different manner, or maybe it helped you discover something about yourself you didn't previously know. And for me, it helped when I thought back to those scores. It helped me understand why some people thought I was mostly logical and analytical, but in the same regard, it explained why I was able to be fairly talented at art and, other things that are creative. And then when I got into college, one thing I did is I became fascinated with web design, because it's not a class I was taking, it's a class my cousin was taking, and they showed them how to, basically the basics of web design and HTML coding. And that, for me, I think I became enthralled in that because it hits on both sides of that fence, both parts of the brain. In one regard, you get to be creative, you get to freely design. In another regard, you get to program and kind of code and use that analytical, logical side. The if this, then that sort of mentality. So, and so what does any of this have to do with religion or belief in God? Well, for me, as I grew up, I could kind of think to myself that I'm not sure about the idea of this ever-present, all-powerful, sort of dogmatic being in God, and the literal nature that some people believe in, that, there is a heaven, there is a God, there is an afterlife, and there is a consequence of going to heaven or to hell, depending upon your actions while you're alive. And the analytical, logical side of me always sort of struggled with that literal idea, or the idea in general. Let's just say the entire idea. And there's a question or a way of thinking about it that I've come across recently that has intrigued me to no end, and has helped explain my own struggle with this internally. And it's certainly not my idea. It's not my thought. You'll hear me reference this person a lot on the podcast, like I did on the first episode, but it comes mostly from Jordan Peterson. And when the discussion of belief in God comes up with him, he says that he does not. He says, I don't say that I believe in God. He says, I behave as though he exists. And I'll say that again in case you haven't heard it before. Or maybe I went too fast. I just want to be clear. He doesn't say he believes in God. He behaves as though he exists. And then there's a lot of explanation behind that. And you can certainly go watch a lot of his videos or podcasts or his discussions with folks like Sam Harris, which I've talked about before, I think. But it's a question, I think, that is worth asking to anyone who says they believe in God, and to all those who say they don't believe in God. And I'm fascinated by that idea. And so here's my question then, based on that, which is it more important to you when you are examining another person? Is it more important that they say they believe in things, whatever that may be, like God? Or is it more important that they act a certain way? And another way to say it is, what is more important out of the two, if you had to pick one? What you say you believe, or what you do every day? And one argument that Jordan Peterson makes, for instance, is that he has very interesting discussions with atheists, because most, I don't know the facts on this, but if you were to classify an atheist, you'd say, well, that's a person who doesn't believe in God, right? And I think possibly one idea that a lot of people have about atheists is they're, you say you don't believe in God. You say it, and you're proud to say it. So you must be unethical. You must say, well, that gives you the right to do terrible things, to lie, cheat, or steal, right? All those things, right? Because they don't believe in the moral authority, the dogmatic figure of God. They don't believe in an afterlife. So they must be bad people, right? And so Jordan Peterson will talk to these folks, and say, well, okay, tell me about how you go about life. And say you'll have one that will go through, well, I'm a decent human being. I tell the truth. I take care of myself. I take care of my family. I do good for others. I try to take care of those around me. And then you say, well, your actions show what you believe in more than what you say you believe in. And how is that not true? Really think about that. It seems so simple when you just say it out loud like that. And I could be completely late to the party, and anybody watching or listening to this could be just laughing. And I get that, maybe I am completely late to this sort of thought process. But is it not more important to be morally good, to take care of yourself, to take care of your family, to take care of others, to not lie, cheat, or steal? Isn't that what is ultimately what's most important? Because we all know that there are plenty of people who will tell you all day long what they believe in, like God, but are reprehensible people, right? They lie, they cheat, they steal, they, operate out of a need for power. They're greedy, those kind of people. And I've heard folks talk about how when you come across like a Twitter profile of a person and they, one of the first things they list is, believer in God or anything like that, anything that's religious. It's like, well, those are the people you got to be aware of, or not be aware of, but be aware of. Excuse me. Because why do you feel the need to call that out? Right? Why do you have to label yourself like that? Big believer in God. In God we trust, that sort of thing. It's kind of like that. This is a very simplified version of it, but like you talk about, well, men who get really, really big trucks or, really expensive sports cars. It's that kind of joke like, I wonder what he's, compensating for. Well, I'm not saying it's wrong to say you believe in God out loud, to verbalize that. But I think it's so much more important to prove that belief with your actions. And that I want to pose this question to someone who doesn't believe in God. I want to ask them how they go about their daily lives. Because I think you could make the case that if you can set aside the literal definition or the literal idea, the idea of a literal dogmatic being in God that is something you cannot see, but it's there. It's somewhere maybe literally and figuratively above us in the heavens. There is heaven. If you can take away the literal nature of those ideas and then maybe focus on, the stories themselves, and then connect, and then can you make any connection between how you live your life every day and what you might perceive as the value in the stories of religion? And can you make any connection there? And so if you are a person who is good, generally, who at least aims to be good, to be better for yourself every day, to be better for your family every day, to be a good person in the community, in your neighborhood, among your friends, goes to job and does an honest day's work and is trying to be an example for your family, for your kids, be an example for folks you work with. And if you're somebody that lives your life like that, then, and you can say, well, there is moral value in the stories behind religion. And could you really say that you don't believe in God? If you could kind of rationalize, or if you could connect belief in God purely with actions, that's something I want to explore. And I want to explore in much more detail than me kind of rambling about it. And there's this idea that you can find meaning in the stories of religion. Take the Bible and, Christianity, and then, think about the stories told in the Bible, and forget for a second, what the kind of literal play out of the stories are, like Noah and the flood. Forget for a second that was there that the whole idea, well, was there an actual ark built by a person named Noah? Did the entire earth flood, and was every human being besides Noah and the folks and animals on the ark wiped out? Forget about the literal idea of that story, and then start to think about, well, does this mean something? What would this mean? And can you derive any meaning that can be applied to life in 2020? And I don't know that you can't. I think if you really sat and thought about it, and not for like 20 minutes, but for days, is there not meaning that can be derived from these stories? And then you can also say, well, what meaning do you come from some of the, the more darker stories in the biblical text and in the Quran and in, any religion throughout history? And that's where some of the postmodernists and atheists would rally behind the idea that, religion has no place because of some of the atrocities that have been carried out in history behind religious ideas. And there's value in that discussion as well, in that idea as well. And so that's where I'd like to discuss this and kind of bounce ideas off one another with different people. And so I think that's probably where I'll leave it. I don't want to get too deep into my own ramblings and my own head on that. I just want to kind of put that out there. I welcome the comments on Facebook or Twitter or YouTube. Share this with your friends. Share this with your family. And discuss this among yourself. Maybe you've been going to church all your life and you're a devout believer in God. Maybe you've never gone to church and you think the whole idea is rubbish and that it's a silly, childlike sort of idea that there is a being like God. I don't know. Most of these stories are thousands of years old, and millions upon millions of people have relied on them for guidance and for, strength and meaning. And I don't think that's something that you can just throw away lightly and dismiss. But I also don't think you can read something like the Bible and claim to know exactly what it's supposed to mean. And just, take it for what it is literally saying. I don't think it's as simple as either. So follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Subscribe on YouTube. I know I keep pointing to an area of the screen where there might be a subscribe button. I'm still figuring out how to work YouTube Studio and, put things on the screen that you can click. But at least at the end of the video here, there'll be something to click on. I really appreciate anybody who subscribes and follows us. I know it's still kind of bad, and this it still hasn't been actual dialogue with another person. I get that. I'm trying to get to that point. I really am, and I'm not going to stop. I won't give up. So stick with me. We'll get there, and have a great day, and have a great weekend on this Saturday, and we'll talk to you soon. Goodbye.